You prefer to close this one for the light, like close the curtain?
I think that's actually better because we've got the light shining through.
As you want.
So it just highlights you beautifully.
Perfect.
We've caught up with Silo here in his recording studio. Many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for coming over in my humble cave. Yes.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, let's start by talking about how you originally got involved with making house music.
Oh well, I don't know exactly what was the when was the day that I started making house music. It's been like a process coming up from the days of playing in bands, school bands, and then moving towards starting buying vinyls. And I was really into scratching at the beginning. The whole scratching thing really amazed me at the time, and I started buying loads of records and DJing in school parties and friends and in my own house for just small parties, and then slowly got into playing some small clubs back in Italy back in the days. And then I was quite lucky because when I was 21 I got selected by Red Bull to become one of their resident DJs for the Red Bull events, and so I started DJing for Red Bull all around Europe, and that quite opened a few doors. And then obviously in the meantime I was already making music, but I didn't release nothing so far. But then I started releasing under different names and breakbeat and drum and bass and different things, until then I moved to London and I started the solo thing. And I didn't start with the precise intent of making any particular kind of music. I was just playing around with, I've always been into sampling loads of stuff and going, being in London for me was amazing, to be able to go out on a Wednesday morning and go West London, crate digging and buy some cheap vinyls, and then finding crazy Indian samples, and then going back to studio and spend the whole night trying to come up with something. And eventually I came up with a few midget songs, and that kind of defined the solo sound. And then here we are, still there 5 years later. I'm still there still buried in my studio chasing for samples. Nothing changed really.
As you mentioned, you grew up in Italy. What's the electronic music scene like in Italy?
Well, it is very, like house music is the king. It's like in Italy we have a huge amount of clubs, and the culture towards clubbing is very, very developed since the 80s. So I have an older brother who has been, when he was coming to pick me up at school with his car, because he's much older than me. I remember him playing to me these big house mixtapes at the time on tape, and it's kind of from the Italo disco onwards, it's kind of a huge tradition of dance music. So house and techno are very, very big in Italy, and they will always be big. And then obviously other scenes like, again, drum and bass or dubstep, are a bit smaller and a bit less known in Italy than here, or definitely other parts of Europe. But
what projects were you working on with Red Bull Music Academy?
Well, I was working, when Red Bull just started 7-8 years ago to get involved into the nightclubs and the whole dance stuff. What they started doing is I went to the first academy that they've done in New York, and then they started simply having Red Bull parties around Europe. So I was just playing as a DJ at Red Bull parties. There wasn't much behind it, there wasn't much production involved, or definitely not all these Red Bull academies which are all around the world with producers and stuff. At the beginning it was more about them wanting to be into the nightlife, so them taking up a big club in Spain and sending all the DJs to play. That was it really. But for me it was very good because I was relatively unknown, but I had bookings in France and Poland and Spain just by being a Red Bull DJ really, and that was pretty cool.
How influential do you think the Red Bull Music Academy has been on electronic music?
Well, definitely it opened loads of eyes towards unknown producers and the way this weird music world goes. It's very interesting every year when you see the academies and the interviews. I watch all the footage because it's so amazing to see big producers sharing loads of secrets. And I think definitely Red Bull helped a lot the electronic scene to become a bit open to a wider audience. Definitely it's very interesting. It's especially lots of kids are now looking at the academies, or going to the meetings, or going to the things, or going to the website, and even sample lots of the academies interviews, and loads of house records at the moment. They have snippets from interviews from the Red Bull Music Academy, and that is a sort of a statement of how big that thing became. I think, yeah.
Steering back to you, why did you decide to move to London to set up your studio?
Because I was quite comfortable in Italy. At one point, after the whole Red Bull thing, I started DJing quite a lot, and I was always trying to make music, but I was quite relaxed in a way, because I had my 2-3 shows a week just around Italy, really, so just a short drive, and I wanted to make it in a bigger world. I wanted to start playing around the world and release on the labels I've always wanted to release. So I moved to London, where the game was more complicated and you have much more pressure, but definitely that helped me to make connections and and start to learn really how this crazy business works. That was very fundamental for me, to go away from my comfort zone and just came out.
Which labels in particular were you looking to release music?
Well, when I moved away, again, I didn't have a specific, when I started the solo project, I didn't have a specific plan, but I've always loved some labels, which then eventually, the biggest case was obviously Dirty Bird. I've always loved Dirty Bird, because at the time for me was the craziest label ever. They were putting out some crazy stuff, completely different. And when I had the possibility of releasing my EP on there, for me was sort of like, a big deal, really. So yeah, then that happened again because of London, because my song was played in a club and Justin Martin was playing in that club, and he asked what that was, and Von Stroke got it, and then here we go, and that kind of kick-started the whole thing for me. Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Dirty Birds is it's kind of a community, which is opposed to just like a label and this is how you're going to do it. It's like they're really involved in all aspects
parties,
of their music.
And Von Stroke is a very nice person. You can always ask advice for tracks and stuff. He's really listening to everything that everyone sends to him. I really am amazed by how much time he puts into listening to every single demo and every single thing that he receives, either from an artist, from the label, but even from everyone else. He's really keen into giving advice. I really like it. I really like the way that Dirty Bird builds the whole reputation. Yeah.
So what are you going to be working on whilst you're back here in London?
Well, now I have about a month where I decided to be pretty much in London. Besides maybe a couple of shows, I'm going to be locked in, and I'm working on 2-3 new EPs, like 4 or 5 new songs, house songs. And in the meantime, I'm also working on some beats, like not house, so working with some singers. And then what I'm working on at the moment is also setting up my label. I'm gonna, open my label in. First release is going to be probably early September. So the first records are already there, and I signed some people on, and I'm working myself on some releases. But the whole preparing the label is quite a demanding task. You have to decide everything, graphics and the whole idea behind the label. So now it's also lots of meetings going on, and yeah.
What's the name of the label?
The name of the label is going to be called Congaloid, like my first release on Dirty Bird, because that's a name which is very dear to me, obviously, and it's a sort of obviously it doesn't mean nothing. It's a name which I invented once, being very stoned in studio, and it's kind of representing me. Everyone knows that was my first song, so I thought let's call it like this. So that's going to be the name. Congaloid Records, yes.
What artists are you hoping to release, or have lined up to release?
Well, I've lined up a few artists already. Basically, what I want to do is, obviously, I do have lots of friends in this business, and but I don't want to necessarily release only my friends and the obvious ones. I would like to start releasing also people which are making amazing house music, but they're not very big. And nowadays there are so many demos, so many blogs, so many releases that it's very easy to miss some good songs. I spend an average of 7 or 8 hours a week chasing every artist, from the most famous ones to the promos to the completely unknown labels. And I found out some very amazing, in my humble opinion, producers which have released maybe 1 song or 2, but they don't play, they don't have remixes. So I wrote to them and they sent me straight away some very good demos. So I've been, lining up releases so far with these completely unknown producers. And also, obviously, I already have some remixes planned and some releases by the most, family, like Monkey Safari and obviously Zombie Disco Squad and all the family. They're going to be all part of this label that I want to build up. But I want to focus pretty, a lot into looking for new producers and try to put them on a map. As it worked for me back 3 years ago when people and labels put me on a map. I wish now I could do the same, you know, for other people, basically, you know, and possibly start doing label parties and have them playing with me, you know. And yeah, you know, I have a dream, you know, have a big image behind this. Now let's see if it works.